Okay, sorry. Okay. There we go. We are now recording. Okay, so I just want to welcome everyone again to meet the author with Menachem Kaiser as we discuss his book, Plunder, A Memoir of Family Property and Nazi Treasure. I want to thank our sponsors for tonight's evening, Barbara Osband, Carol Hirsch, Shachrit Rosenthal, and Margot Weiss. I also want to dedicate this evening to Refuah Shlema for our dear Chef Meir Rappaport, who is actually from the same city in Poland, Sosnovich, that Menachem writes about in Plunder. Please have him in your tefillos, especially tomorrow morning, as he undergoes a medical procedure. His Hebrew name is Meir Yechiel Ben Leah. For those of you who don't yet know, and here's your disclaimer, Menachem is my brother, and we are very excited to have him here, and we are all very proud of his accomplishments. There's a lot I can tell you about Menachem, but the pertinent info would be that he has an MFA from University of Michigan. He was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania, a Wexner Scholar, and is published widely in many national publications. Plunder is his first book. My mother would also want me to tell you that, yes, he is single. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions for discussion in advance. I may not get to all of them, but we're going to try our best. My conversation with Menachem will assume that you've read the book, so we're not going to be requesting summaries or synopses from him. But following our discussion, we'll take questions from the audience. Please type your questions into the chat, and we hope we'll get to all of them. We're going to do our best. And if we don't get to any questions, Menachem's going to post an email and his website where you can reach out to him directly, and he's really good at getting back to you.
I'm pretty good at getting back to you.
You are.
I will do it. I will do it. This might take a couple days.
Okay. Well, now he has to. Now he has to. Okay, if you are not muted, please make sure that you're muted so that we can get through this cleanly. And then at the end, we're going to unmute for whoever wants to ask a direct question. Okay, before we get to specific questions relating to the book, I think some of our audience members had asked more about Menachem's background in Europe and wanting to know about his connection to Poland, specifically to Eastern Europe. Sorry, specifically to Poland, and then just to, like, in general, to Eastern Europe. He's a typical Jewish boy from Toronto, and that's not a typical thing to be doing, flying back and forth to that region. So Menachem, can you please share with our participants, our audience, what you were doing in Poland, like before the book begins, and what kind of connection you had developed with the area?
Sure. First of all, thank you everyone for having me. Thank you, Riva, for organizing it. Hi, Mom and Dad. And any other Kaisers who are lurking somehow. So it was a series of mistakes, actually. So I went in college, I went to Columbia University, and you needed a foreign language to graduate. And I missed the Hebrew placement exam. I missed it. I'm pretty sure I could have passed it and would have satisfied that foreign language, but I missed it. And so I decided to take Yiddish so I could understand my Uncle Henry's jokes. And then he actually, in like a real Henry twist, he passed away the next year. So I never really got to understand his jokes, but I had 4 semesters of Yiddish. So on paper, I was pretty fluent. And so I was interested in doing a Fulbright, and basically to qualify for a Fulbright, the only way you're going to be competitive is to do it to go to a country that has, where you have the language. And so Yiddish kind of, was pretty limiting. So basically it was Poland and Lithuania, and everyone encouraged me to do Lithuania. And my Yiddish teacher allowed me to complete my own language assessment exam. So it was off the charts. It was really, my Yiddish language on paper was exceptional. And then, so I got the Fulbright, but I didn't go for any family reasons. I went to study sort of like Yiddish culture. That turned out to not happen through a series of kind of crazy coincidences. I ended up studying the Vilna Ghetto, but up until that point, again, wasn't really like, I grew up knowing that my grandparents were from Poland, but it wasn't like a thing, like we weren't raised in a house where like, you should go back to Poland. Wait, Riva, did you do a March of the Living tour?
I did. Right. Not March of the Living. I did it through Mechila.
Right. So I think I have 3 older sisters, including Riva, and I think 2 of them did a March of the Living, I believe, but no one went back to like our grandparents' hometowns. And so it wasn't really like impressed upon us that was an important thing. I think it was the idea it would be meaningful, but it wasn't something that like we grew up with like this sense of responsibility to go to where our grandparents came from. And so I actually never felt all that compelled to go to Poland. And so I spent a year in Lithuania doing research. And then I met the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is a region that does not exist anymore, but yet it has a chief rabbi and his son. And they're very colorful characters. They're big machers in Brooklyn. And they sort of reside, a quarter of the year in Krakow. And I met them. I helped them out with some stuff in Vilnius. And they invited me to come to Krakow for Rosh Hashanah. And I went to Poland that first year. It's, in the first chapter of the book. I went to visit my grandfather's hometown. I took some photos, and at that point, I really thought I would never go back. But I kind of fell in love with Poland, to be honest. I found it to be sort of what I had hoped Lithuania was. I found it to be very stimulating. I found kind of the people and institutions there to be very open and very welcoming, very curious. There was a tremendous amount of support. The summers there, especially sort of centered around the Jewish festivals, bring in just like enormous amount of like talent and scholarship from all over the world. And so I just sort of, I was really pulled in. And so for the next 3 or 4 years before I began the reclamation process, I sort of ended up doing quite a bit more research about the Vilna Ghetto, but I used Poland and mostly Krakow as my kind of headquarters. And I got really interested in certain questions of Jewish history and Jewish memory, particularly surrounding memorials. And so I found Poland to be sort of endlessly stimulating. And so for the next few years, I would say I spent my summers there. I would say like 1 to 2 months a year, going back and forth and sort of hopping over to Vilnius when I needed to do more research.
That's a lot of time in Poland.
A lot of
Yeah.
time in Poland.
Yes, yes. Okay, so I hope that gives people a better background picture of what you were doing there and what your exposure was. Okay, so the next question I have is that you write immediately in the beginning of the book that when you started the reclamation process for the building, you were hoping to better get to know our grandfather through doing that. So I was wondering, like, why would that be a process to better get to know him? Why not just sit down and interview our parents, our relatives, any surviving friends? Wouldn't that bring you somewhat closer in terms of getting a better picture of who he was?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I wouldn't say that the main motivation behind trying to reclaim the building was getting to know Zadie. And it's nice I could say Zadie to you, and like we share that now. But that wasn't like that was. I would say it's something like a little deeper and a little bit more abstract. I think it was like I felt like I was in conversation with him in a way that I never been before, and like the way I articulate now, even after the book, is sort of like being in a sort of sentimental relationship with him. And in ways like I saw his frustrated attempts to reclaim the building, I was like, oh, I could be part of that. Whether I would succeed or whether I would fail, I felt like I could continue this very particular part of his legacy. And so it was getting to know him, but it was getting to know him in a particular way. And I was very interested in questions back then of like how memories pass down. I was very interested in like sort of how things are memorialized in Poland. And so like real estate is like a very rich entry point to those questions. And so yeah, initially it felt like a personal way into questions I was interested in. Having spent at that point 4 or 5 years doing research in this field, and so it felt like sort of a gift. I was like, oh, I could sort of investigate questions I'm interested in, and also have it be a personal story. At that point, I wasn't going to write a book about it, but yeah, and so like but after once it sort of got more serious, I did like sit down with my parents who are here and try to get like more specific memories, um, try to get a better sense. We have, in the den in our house, we have like a big box of my grandparents' documents, like wartime documents that no one had ever sorted through. And so there was all these like applications to Germany for medical assistance. So I started going through those. So I did get some more details, but yeah, it wasn't like here's how to get to know him. It is not the most efficient way to get to know someone, for sure.
Okay, but one way, so I understand that a little better. Okay, another question for you is when you originally started and you went to the building. You took the time to get to know the building, get to know the residents, and made some personal connections there, and certainly invested a lot of time. However, once you found out that was the wrong building and then corrected the building, you didn't do the same due diligence or effort. Your approach was completely different once it came to a second building, and there was nothing personal. So why the change?
Yeah, I was kind of running on empty. Like that's the truth. Like the idea of like going in again, I just couldn't muster up like the courage and the kind of energy to do it again. Like the way I write in the book is like it was really honest. And this was just like, you go through the story, again, the chronology in the book is a little fuzzy, but like this thing was going on for 5 years. And so it's just, and you sort of, it's kind of like exciting maybe in the book, and it is exciting while you're there, but when there's like a series of encounters stacked up next to each other, especially in a really compressed time period, because I would go for 1 month or 2 months and like squeeze all my research trips, it's kind of like a little scary, it's a little annoying, and it's just like I just felt completely drained. And like, yeah, I felt I not exactly misled, but I felt like I was on this like hapless series of errors. And I was like, oh, the real building was like pulled away from me. I felt like I invested a lot of time, much more time, like much more than is apparent in the book, because I was having correspondences with these people. I visited it at least another 6 or 7 times. That's not recorded in the book. I met with Hannah, that woman. I met with her, I don't know, 7 or 8 times. Um, and it was just like all of a sudden you're like, oh, I guess it's not the building. And you're like, what happens to that like attachment? It just sort of instantly evaporated. And then you're like, you come to the new building, and I was kind of mad. You're just kind of upset, and you're just kind of annoyed at not at anyone, because this was no one's fault, or maybe it was my lawyer's fault, but like, yeah, you're just drained. And I was just like, I'm not doing that again. I just like, I couldn't imagine doing it.
Fair enough, I hear. I couldn't imagine doing it the first time. Forget
When
about twice.
when you read that part, did you feel like I should have? I mean, I'm interested in like, because to me that's sort of like a hairy part of the book.
I think I
Like,
would have been, there was that curiosity about the building. You certainly described the first building, and we get a sense of what it looks like, but I have no idea what the actual building does look like. So that element, in terms of the residents, the inhabitants, that's less significant, but at least some kind of visual description of the building.
so
There we go.
this is the correct building, actually. So this is on the corner, and so you could see the Aptica, which is the pharmacy, on the bottom level. And so it's a corner building on a much busier intersection, and it's just like immediately like looks much more like a building that existed in the 1930s than the other one.
And
And
that
so
pharmacy is currently there and has been there, right?
that pharmacy, as far as I can tell, has been continuously in operation from when our grandparents were the landlords. Yeah. I had like in the book, I had a correspondence with the owner, and the owner, as soon as she understood who I was, shut it down, just completely shut it down. And I tried again through an intermediary. That's not in the book. I got other people to try like to be more gentle. And she just was not, she was not open to having a conversation with me.
Well, you discuss that reaction in your book about
Yeah.
Poles withdrawing and being fearful. So that,
Yeah.
from their perspective, I hear that makes sense. So what has happened with the building since you finished writing the book?
Well, let's see. The building, nothing with the building per se, but
The court proceeding.
literally the day I submitted the final draft, the courts got back to me and said like, oh, here are the death certificates, the death recognitions. That happened quite literally the day we sort of like locked in the book, which honestly and felt inevitable. Like, of course, it's going to happen like after I can no longer write about it. So that happened, and so that was like a big hurdle that was cleared. Over Pesach, we had a trial in which my father was called to testify, and so that was another hurdle that was cleared. And so we're close, but like, it's just it's like no matter how it takes like an infinite series of half steps, like you're going forward, but you're only like another halfway there, and then you're another halfway there. So it just feels like it's going to be like an eternal and incremental process. And so I don't know. I like we're doing everything right, put it that way. So it's like it is progressing, but I don't know. It's been a weird year. The courts are in backlog, and so I don't know.
So knowing what you know now,
Yeah.
would you do it all again?
Well, there's a tougher way of asking this question. The tougher is knowing what I know. Would I do it again? And I didn't have a book.
Okay.
Like that. Like the nice thing about a book, and like this is sort of like how the sausage is made, is like, man, does it motivate you? Like it's just sort of this thing is like the errors are really annoying and like the court cases are really annoying, but it does give you good content. And so like it becomes a very complicated thing of like, yes, it's frustrating, but also the story is being enriched. And so I would. It's like it's not like I've spent the last 6 years living in Poland, like living in Sosnovich, like beating down doors, writing petitions. It's been like a part of my life that I've been able to like let the process unfold and live my life sort of on a parallel track and like go in when I needed to go in. So yes, for sure. It was like even besides the book, it was just like an incredible experience, like thoroughly. So I would feel very grateful for the opportunity.
Okay. So then why not have written a book completely about that experience? Why combine a whole nother story that's going on?
You're saying the treasure hunters.
Yes.
Okay. It's a good question. I might not have a satisfying answer. So if my answer is not satisfying, you should push me on it. So like, well, let me say this. I would say like when I started out, like in 2015, when I sat with the lawyer, I figured out the paper. Like I got my father faxed me those pages. I went through them. I found out the building was worth all that money. And I was like, okay, let's do this. I like basically when the story starts, at that point, I was like, I will never write about this. I was like, I am not going to write anything about this. And like, for reasons like, it's just because like to write, I didn't think I could write an interesting story about that. I felt like it was a genre that is crowded. And I'm not saying it's not meaningful and really interesting and like very meaningful to me personally and to my family, but I didn't see how to like create a story that could be interesting to other readers. Um, I didn't know how I would be able to sell a story like that to a market. And so, and I also didn't want to, I didn't want to write that. I didn't like, it wasn't something that I like felt compelled to write about. I got into it for sort of like pure reasons. And I didn't want it to be a thing that I was like, I didn't want to be a journalist of my own life. And that's a thing that inevitably happens. But then what happened is like I met the treasure hunters and you guys read the book. The story gets very weird, very strange, and very compelling. And at that point, two things happen. One, I was like I'm sort of reluctantly, and I was a little bit exasperated by this. I was like, the story just got so interesting that at this point, I have to at least try this. I have to at least try like a little bit of a secret, like I don't really say this in large presentations, but in a book club, it feels like more safe. It's like I was also in grad school at the time. I was like in an MFA program, and like the objective in the MFA program is get an agent. Get an agent, and like then you get an agent, and you're like, how can I sell a book? And I was at when I did the whole treasure hunter narrative happen, I was like, I think I have a viable book here. And you know that, and then it happened really quickly. And so like the agent was like, yep. And then you write a book proposal, and that happened in 2017. So like really fast, that sort of like that train left. And then I found myself committed to the story way before I wrote, I don't know, 90% of it, maybe 95% of it. So that's a little bit like of the, the technical part. But something also happened with the treasure hunters. The treasure hunters allowed me to sort of reapproach my story with my grandfather. It sort of reframed what I was doing in a way that I was able to do it much more honestly than I thought. Like, had I tried to write this story without the treasure hunter, just about the building, I would not have known how to write about my relationship with Zadie, because like I didn't know him, and it would have sort of defaulted into like that familiar sentimental arc of like the grandchild sort of reaching for his grandfather and sort of a redemptive end. The treasure hunters, in like this weird, unexpected way, allowed me to sort of like articulate my ignorance and to sort of like be a lot messier in the narrative and a lot more honest about like that I don't know what's going on, that like I'm really confused about like what things mean. I am allowed to sort of to fumble this. And it's sort of like those errors and like those mistakes and also kind of honestly those adventures like to me really enrich the story by making it a lot messier and a lot like none of those familiar narratives applied anymore. And so it reframed the story in a way. And okay, so that's like the good answer. And like the more sort of like sleazy answer is that it made a much more marketable book.
So when you say that it allowed you to have a better connection with Zadie, was that through the whole saga of Abraham Kaiser?
It wasn't necessarily a better connection with Zadie. I think it was like a way for me to understand my own story with respect to Zadie. And so it was like what they did is they sort of like they pushed me that whole narrative. It sort of like pushed me into these situations or encounters or ideas that like I didn't know what things meant. And so I was able to be like, what is my relationship to Zadie? And I was able to ask that question really honestly and really openly, even if I didn't have a solid answer. And so I was like, what am I doing with this building? Becomes like, that's an interesting question, but it becomes like, to me, a much richer and stranger question when it's put into relief by like all these people literally plundering. And you're like, what am I doing here? Like, what does this mean? And so it's, to me, it enriched the story. And I don't know how apparent that is on the page, but it sort of freed me up as a writer to sort of like do it in a way that felt honest to me, at least.
Mm. So what is the answer to that question?
I don't have an answer. You guys know just as well as I do. You guys read the book.
Okay, so talking about treasure hunters, I know you have some really cool pictures of what you saw when they took you on those field trips.
I'll show you. Let me show you. Okay, yep. Screen share screen. Share. Is it visible?
Mm-hmm.
So this is from that first, that in the book when I first go down, this is actually from that visit. So this is Sobon, that small tunnel, which I described. These are the wooden A-frames, which I talk. This, like the camera that Jason used to take is like a very fancy Leica. And so it captures light really well. So you don't really get an appreciation of how dark it was. It was easily the darkest place I've ever been in my life. And so here's more of that Sabon walking in. This is the second tunnel, Osufka, which is the much larger one. And you can see the reinforced concrete. The room around the corner is like one of the more chilling and strange rooms. It's like a room of concrete. It really feels like a villain's lair. Here, this is Osonasufka, and here you can start seeing how they went about building the tunnels. So they would bore two parallel holes, one on top of each other, and then collapse the sort of arc in between them to make a much larger space. This is like everything here is original. Like these tracks were there; they were used to cart out the rubble. They added the netting, so errant rocks don't fall. This is also Nasufka. Like this ceiling is like 20 meters, or for you Americans, like 40 to 50 feet tall. So like it's a really enormous room. The scale is hard to appreciate in this room, but like from where the photographer is standing till the far end is something like 200 yards. It's like a really enormous space. And then let me go quick back. This I described quickly in that conspiracy theory chapter. This is the rig for the UFOs that they, or what they claim is the rig for the UFOs. And so it's that fence is taller than me. And so like to give you a sense of scale, it's really big. And so it is really weird. It is not a testing rig for UFOs, but that's the story they tell. And so those are those photos.
Wow. Um, Even though I've seen them already, every time I see them, they make such an impression. Okay, so when you started talking and spending time with the treasure hunters, and really right in the beginning, Maya posed that question that never got answered. And that was, how are they affected? How are the treasure hunters affected by the history of the tunnels? Do you think that they give proper respect to the murdered Jews? And like even the gift, and I want to really expand that to, let's say, the Poles that you met in general. Even the gift shop clerk where you bought the book, you bought Avram Kaiser's book when you were going around to the different camps, he expressed skepticism about the horrors that Kaiser wrote about. And by extension, that would also relate to other Jews. Like if he's not believing what he's actually reading about, then why would he believe the full stories of anyone else? So what is the general sentiment in Poland today about the suffering and the near annihilation of Jews during the Holocaust?
Big question. Let me say off the top, I am not an expert. So like I do not speak Polish. And so like my sort of my knowledge is going to be very limited. And so like it's gonna, and also I like the people I've spent time with are going to be of a particular sort. And so I have like my friends and the people I know in, let's say, the larger cities, and they tend to be much better educated, much better traveled, have met much more people, and are much more, let's say, open-minded than the average person, the average Pole. And then I have the treasure hunters who are, again, not representative of Poles in general, probably. They're very into the war. They tend to be more nationalist. They tend to be sort of like kind of obsessed, as you see, about certain things and tropes and themes. Um, but let me sort of offer a counterexample that I do not talk about in the book, but just in all of these small cities and in the large cities, much of the Jewish memory is sort of, I would say, energized by non-Jews. And so like in Benjin, for example, the people on the ground doing what I would call memory work are these Piotr and his wife Anna, and they have preserved museums. They have raised tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to secure these. They would find these stiebels. When you see cemeteries being preserved, it's almost always sort of being spearheaded by non-Jews. Many of the scholars, many of the artists are doing really important work. Like so there is a weird Jewish energy for sure. I probably know, I don't know, 20 to 30 Polish people who have converted or are in the process of converting to Judaism. And so there absolutely is a like sizable population of Poles who go above and beyond, I would say, in sort of preserving and commemorating Jewish memory. On a large scale, is what is being done enough? No way. Like there's just no way. I think I'm not an expert. I don't know. I think largely it's not coming out of malice. I think it's coming out of indifference and apathy, which is still really problematic. And it's going to be different in like the cities and in more rural areas. And so, like with the treasure hunters, are they sufficiently respectful? No, not really. Like I think that's a tough metric. Like what would they do in order to sort of like qualify? But again, it's complicated because it's like they're a big population. There's a lot of them. I've met dozens of them, so they're hard to neatly categorize. I mentioned it very briefly in the book, but like I would meet treasure hunters who have grandparents who are Jewish and who were in the camps. I have not met any treasure hunters who identify themselves as Jewish, but they absolutely see themselves as having a Jewish legacy, and they see their work as response to that. And now it might not be like the way we would relate to it, and it might be sort of, it feels very strange for them to sort of like go into these spaces and digging them up. Um, so yeah, and so partly that's problematic, but I'll say also larger and like, there's a chapter in the book which certain, yeah, I would not the most controversial chapter, but the chapter that ruffled people a little bit is like when I spend time with them in the forest and like it's sort of like a party atmosphere. The chapter that was supposed to be after that actually got cut. And to me, that was like an interesting corrective because the next morning they all woke up before dawn and they spent 14 hours cleaning. That was the exploration. they cleaned. They like built their own ladder. They built their own pulley system. I actually probably have a cool photo of it. And
What were they cleaning?
so what, one second, let me pull this up. Well, basically had been like an illegal film shoot, and the film shoot had left like just tons of garbage and debris. And so they spent 2 full days, like 14-hour days cleaning these sites. And that really sort of like changed how I viewed these guys, because I think on one hand, like the way their attitude towards these spaces was, I had a lot of problems with, and it feels very queasy, like the way they're interacting with these spaces. On the other hand, these are the guys who are taking care of these. There is no one else. Like if it wasn't them, these sites would be lost, and kind of fully. They'd be, no one's commemorating. There are no museums. There's no institutional. There's very little scholarship. This is way, way off. Like, let's call it the Holocaust memory map. It's very far from any like sort of centers, and so there is a sense of guardianship. The example I cite very often is like one of the treasure hunters named Krzysztof, who found a concentration camp. He discovered one. It's not in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum directory. It's not in any of the maps. He spent years researching, interviewing locals, pulling out archives, and he took me like in a field. He showed me where the barracks had been. You could still see the bricks, and so like, I think we should have a sense of appreciation of just how much work there is still to be done in terms of memory and commemoration, and it's largely not being done. And if this, to the extent it is, it's going to be sort of like quote unquote amateurs. And these guys are doing that work, sometimes in ways that are, again, really queasy, but it's like very hard to just like neatly condemn them. And so that's like what I strive for a little bit, to sort of like appreciate them holistically.
I mean, that does shed a whole new light on them. It gives a whole different perspective on who they are and the other things that they're doing. And certainly commemorating and memorializing is, very altruistic of them in that respect. And that takes me to a question, a theme that is really rife in the book. You talk tremendously about memory and myth, and memory versus myth, and myth versus memory. You even coined the term myth memories when you talk about what American tourists are bringing with them. So could you speak a little bit about that theme and why you really emphasize it so strenuously throughout the book?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've sort of been like low key obsessed about all my whole time spending in Eastern Europe. It's just like, and in this book, it just got hit. It's like I kept getting hit with it. Like, one, in the sense of like, I chase the story and the story keeps changing, and so the idea is like, oh, this is where my grandfather grew up. Just, no, it's not. This is the correct building. This is not the correct building. The address has changed. What your story, like, you would come with these stories, and they have, I think the phrase I use in the book is congealed into lore, but they're often unexamined. And to me, like, that doesn't make them less meaningful or less interesting, but it does sort of, these things are much more amorphous and like hazy, and like they shape shift on you. And so that line, I think, is much blurrier than some people appreciate. And so, and once we sort of appreciate that, like, these things start bleeding into each other quite a bit, we get to sort of reapproach the myths, and sort of like, what truth do those myths hold? And like in this case, we have like those, I have a whole chapter just of like mythical treasures, and I mix it in with like real treasures. And to me, the larger point that I was trying to make is that like, some of these are true and some of these are false, but the central message is identical. Not necessarily identical, but like, there's a theme throughout. And I think anytime you step into something like that's somewhat held sacred, uh, or really prized, or really celebrated, or really guarded, um, yeah, like there isn't going to be objective truth in memory. It just doesn't. It's never there. And so, to like better appreciate is what we are saying, what we are handing down. Like, I do think a sort of more responsible, let's call it historical mode, is to appreciate like that these truths are fuzzier, and like they're just good myths are going to be incorporated into them.
It certainly left me with a feeling that I should never really fully believe any of these stories anymore, and not to downgrade them or invalidate them, but just to kind of say that not every part of it may be true, and there's an understanding that over time and over different tellings, things do get adjusted or changed in some way.
Inevitably, but to me, that's not like a sign. That's not about credibility. Like that's the fact that the stories are alive.
Mhm.
Like that's what it is, that they sort of adapt or not adapt. And like this is in no way sort of undermining anything so like about witness, which to me like first person accounts are always going to be our primary source of information and have to be like guarded and cherished and like and passed down. This is, I'm speaking much more broadly and in terms of like how we tell our stories and sort of like reappreciate our histories and our myths. And like we have that in like in Jewish tradition of like what like in terms of like a Gadata. And it's like what is like we hold great meaning in stories, even if like they're not historically true. Like that's not always our like our central, like that's not our core belief when we tell stories necessarily. There could be like greater meaning there.
True. Yes. I have two more questions for you, Menachem, and then we can open it up to our audience. One is this. I mean, one of the things that I loved about this book is just how you let us into your mind. You know, you never knew what you were going to be reading, whether it was actually something you were telling over or whether you were putting us inside your head and your thought process. And even some of the chapters were actually dialogues that were going on there. But I'm curious if you're willing to share, how did this whole experience change you?
The whole experience of the whole thing, like
The whole thing, the journey. There's an odyssey in this book, and the different experiences that amalgamate into the last page, you know, or the last page may not be the right thing to write here, but
like,
who are you now that you weren't 6, 7, 8 years ago?
I think what like the real gift for me, very personally, was that like I got to really sit and think and write about legacy. And there was just like, to me, there was something very meaningful and rich. And this is a word, and we have like a million words, whether it's like Masora or like tradition or minhag or like inheritance, all these words that are like words that, you know, we are going to bandy about all the time. And I just like, you know, use them the same as you. But there was something like a real gift here was like thinking really deeply about sort of the distinctions in those words, what they actually mean, what they mean to me personally and our family, like more generally, like how that might differ, like what are those responsibilities, like what are those limitations. And so I'm like, yeah, I had never really thought about that. Like they were just sort of these passed down terms, and like, you know, they felt a little bit interchangeable, but like, yeah, I that is something, I don't know to the extent it's changed me yet, but like certainly like seeds get planted when you're like in that headspace and start really sort of mulling what these things mean and how things get passed down and how things don't get passed down. And so, you know, to like what to me a very meaningful moment was like that sort of the reinstatement of a minhag in our family. Like when, you know, with the Havdalah getting dabbed on the eyes, you know, and my father saw the video with his father and he saw that minhag and that had been like quote unquote lost, and we got reminded of it. And that was like to me very special in a way that I yeah, you're like, okay, well, this chain of like the transmission of like more than information, it's identity, to be like reconnected. And so yeah, I mean like it's been a weird ride for sure. The you know, the reception of the book has been not what I expected. And so you're just sort of like, there's been a lot of intake. And so like we'll see what happens, but a lot to mull.
Just to clarify, so when you say the reception is not what you expected, that's because it has been received very well.
The Goyim liked it. Like what can I say? It's like I didn't yeah, that's been a gift. I was like, my goals were modest here. My goals were like, have a book, you know, finish the book, get have some readers who liked it that I respected, and yeah, that was it. And like have a thing on my shelf that I could, boast to people in airports about. But like, so the reception was bigger. I would say it was bigger, and yeah, it wasn't what I was expecting. It was like it's been a real gift in that sense.
Well, we're all really proud of you. We get to come along for the ride too. One final question, the title. So I know personally, when you told me about the title, I was kind of taken aback. It's a very strong, somewhat abrasive word. But when I read the book, it made perfect sense in so many capacities. So I was wondering if you could share with everyone just the story of the title.
Yeah, it wasn't the title I chose. Originally, when I sold the book, I've never had, I've never written a book before, but like in writing other articles or essays, that's always actually come very easy to me, titles. And so, and then you find a title and you're like, that's it. I found it. It fits. And I thought I found it. So initially I called the book Kaiser, but spelled like Polish, Kajzer. And that's how the book was sold to the publisher as Kaiser. But basically, immediately, the editor was like, there's no way. There is no way we're using this title. It wasn't even up for discussion. And I understood it. They're like, number one, no Americans are going to be able to pronounce it. Like, that's never going to happen. Two, it doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. And like you have to take all these things into account, which you don't think about. You have to like take into account the Audible version. So you're having like Kaiser by Kaiser, just, it's doesn't, yeah, maybe in like 40 years I could write a book like that, but certainly not yet. And so then we went on a process to find a better title, and it did not go smoothly. I came up with 40, I think. I had a short list of 40 titles. I even held a contest among my nephews and nieces. They could come up with a title. They came up with some pretty good ones. Yaakov Riva's son was, he's kind of a genius at titling things, turns out. And so they
And he's
came
very
up with,
upset that you did not go with it.
yeah, he came up with some really experimental titles. And so basically we made a short list. The challenge here was, how do I have a title that incorporated both elements of the book, incorporated the real estate reclamation, and also at least spoke to the treasure hunter narrative. And it was not easy. And so the leading contender for a while was Spoils, actually. And then that was changed to Plunder, and we went with Plunder, one, because it was one word, and that helped a lot. And it was the least worst, honestly. But I, sort of like you, Riva, have come to really like it. I've actually feel like it really works on levels that like I didn't appreciate. And so like in all these presentations, people are asking me like, wow, all these layers were Plunder. And I'm like, yeah, that's an accident. That's like totally an accident. But you know what? That still counts. It totally counts, even if it's an accident. And so yeah, that's more or less the story of the title. I'm too embarrassed to even like look up the titles we didn't go with. They're all like very chunky. And in nonfiction book publishing, you have to have a subtitle. It's not, I wanted to not have a subtitle, but that was not an option. They would not have let me get away with that. And so, yeah, I feel like it's acquired more meaning than when I had started, which is the mark, I think, of a good name.
Oh, it's good. Okay, so that concludes what I had prepared, but I do want to open it up to questions. So let me move over to the chat. And okay, see, Linda, your question was somewhat addressed. So I'm going to pose the second half of the question to Menachem. Linda's whole question is, how did this experience change your life and relationship with your family? So we discussed the first part, but how has it changed your relationship with your family?
Well, the nice thing is my family's here, so they can answer it. I'll answer briefly. I was like, one of the really touching moments was that, early on, I would get this question from interviewers. They would say, what would you say to your grandfather? like if he were alive? And I found that question basically impossible. I was like, I don't know what, like, I don't know. What do you say? And my father, he, we were talking about it and he said, that's not the right question. The question is, what would your grandfather say to you? And so I found that to be like a much more interesting and meaningful question. And then my father actually wrote a document that was a letter, sort of, how would you call it that? Like representing his father, sort of reintroducing his father to his children and to his grandchildren and like our family and our cousins. And to me, that was like a very special moment. Like that was like a moment of sort of like I was like living sort of in this void. I was able to write this book. I was sort of in the book. I'm grasping, and then there was a response, and so that to me was like a very special opportunity. That so but yeah, and then I was nervous how it would affect relationships in the extended family. Um, but so far it has not at all. Either people haven't read it or they are just cool with it. So that's fine. So like nothing so far.
Okay. But I know that already, but okay. Someone asked why the pictures that you showed us, and you only showed us a sampling because I know you have many more. So why didn't you include any pictures in the books? There are, many memoirs or historical nonfiction books will include
Yeah.
a whole sheath of pictures. So why the
I don't
decision not to?
honestly, I don't entirely know. I think early on the here's what I suspect. I think one is the pictures that if I were to have any pictures, I would have to have pictures of the tunnels. And if they would have to have pictures of the tunnels, they would have to be in color. And I think it's just the cost. It just it's just expensive, and I think they weren't interested in sort of subsidizing that cost. Um, and yeah, the book probably would have been another $10 more, and so I think they want to avoid that. I don't know how their budgeting works. The sort of decision was made really early on, no photos. And I also think from a marketing standpoint, this was never articulated to me, so I'm kind of guessing, but I think they wanted to sort of they wanted to market the book as like quote unquote more literary. I think they wanted to be like, this is a literary memoir, which is ridiculous, but fine. And so I think the idea of like having a like Holocaust quote unquote memoir with photos would have sort of nudged it out of that category. And so yeah, that's something that I've gotten a lot of feedback on, that like, why are there no photos? And I hear it. So I am actually working on just like a section on the website to put up a lot of photos, because people seem to want to know what things looked like, which is a totally normal reaction.
Mhm. I was just going to ask you that, but you answered it.
Yeah, / I should be a better writer, so you guys should have pictured it, but that's on me.
Well, some of those tunnels are just, you do a great job describing, but the enormity, the massiveness. Okay, next question. So you write, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you're surprised by the reception just in the general populace. Why do you think it was so well received by non-Jews or people who don't have a connection to the Holocaust?
I think it was refreshing. I think there was like a sort of I like that, the fact that I'm very upfront about what I don't know. And I think that sort of like, I think for Jews, I think especially Ashkenazi Jews living in the US, I think so many of them have stories in their family. And so I think they're going to be able to relate in a way that's I understood and that I had anticipated. But I think like stories and families are universal. And I think there's a certain way that they get told. And I think often they're told in ways that are not that interesting, or they sort of like are overly sentimental, or sort of like not dishonest exactly, but they sort of like, they push a familiar line. And I think that, again, I'm not my own publicist. I guess I am my own publicist, but it's like the idea of uh, this sort of like me saying, I don't know. I'm not sure what to do. I'm very like I strove, no, strove's not a word. I strived to be like upfront about like my limitations and my errors, and I think that that hit a nerve. And also Nazi gold. I mean, like people get interested in that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think bigger than that was like this. Yeah, like there's stories that we tell, and then we like also have to figure out how to tell those stories. And I really tried to do both here.
Okay, definitely. Reading through the questions, did you go back once you picked the title? Did you go back and add the word plunder into any of the chapters?
I think that's only there once. I think it's
Oh, no, it comes up a few times, I think.
I definitely didn't consciously go back. To me, there's a moment in like the last chapter, and like there's that section, not the epilogue, when I sort of the line is we consecrate, comma, and we plunder. So to me, that felt like very on the nose. Like, you know, like in the movie when like someone actually says the title of the movie and you could feel it. So like that to me was that line where I'm like, the title. But otherwise, no. There's not so many synonyms for plunder. Also, I can't think of any.
No,
That
not that have the same connotation, because plunder is a very strong
yeah,
word.
pillage is too weird. I mean, I can't think of any.
I can't see the book being called Pillage. Would not have the same
No,
effect.
I can't. Yeah, yeah. So I find it to be a strange word, mostly because it rhymes with thunder, but it's a weird word.
It has that like abrasiveness, I think I said before. It's a surprising word, but it
Yeah.
works. It works. Okay, next question. What do you mean when you say that we plunder when we try to continue our legacy? Is that
Yeah. It's a strong statement. So what I meant, yeah, I think there's like the idea of plunder and like strip it of its pejorativeness and like just let's put that out of our mind. And I try to do that, and it's hard. But the idea is like we are not, when we sort of act, when we sort of quote unquote continue these stories that we inherit, we are agents as well. Like we're not sort of anonymous. Like we don't just sort of go into the story and the story continues. You are part of that. And yeah, you're sort of, you enter the story, and I wouldn't say you're not exploiting it, you're not using it, but you are it, you in some complicated way become like a new protagonist. And so like, yeah, I feel I've been asked this question like quite a few times in the last few weeks, and I always dig myself a hole when I answer it, I found. And so I that is, I'm gonna stop now. That is going to be my answer, period.
okay? Good, because I have another good one for you.
Okay.
When you have the argument or that you get into that heated exchange with dad, and you quote him saying, "The building, that's not what I want us to share. That's not what I wanted you to inherit." How did you make peace with that? And second part of the question is, did your father feel differently afterwards?
Well, I'm not going to answer for him. He's here, and he knows how to unmute himself if you so want. How did I make it? Was I was very honest in that chapter. Like to me, I found it like hard to hear, and I needed to really reflect on what my father was saying, and I thought my father was saying real truths, and like in a way that I didn't appreciate when he said it. It was like kind of a heated moment. But yeah, I was like, it took maybe a few months, I don't even remember exactly, to say, like, to hear what he was saying, like what it was, what the root of it was, which was like, what are your priorities? And so like, in terms of like, again, going back to like legacy and what's passed down, what gets emphasized, what gets de-emphasized, and if you're doing it in the name of this person, then doesn't that person's priorities are in play. Like you don't get to like carve out that legacy, or like you can carve out a legacy, but is that like an honest way of sort of saying I'm doing something in someone else's name? And so I'm sorry, there's some weird tapping coming from my kitchen. But so, I don't know if it was like, it wasn't a huge rupture and it wasn't like a massively upsetting episode. So like make peace is a strong word, but like it took me time to appreciate and reflect on what he was saying and trying to say to me at the moment. And how he made peace with it, I don't know. I mean, he's, I think in a similar way. But tough question, Riva. I like
Not
it.
mine. I mean, we had a conversation about that also, but I'm not the one who posted here. So thank you, Jennifer. That's all the questions that are in the chat. But if anyone else wants to add or wants to speak up personally, please feel free to unmute yourselves.
I see the Boca Jewish
Go
Center.
ahead.
It's Jennifer. Can I push you on the plunder word? Because I don't get it totally. It's such a negative word for like continuing on a legacy. So I don't get how it has to do with continuing the story or even starting your own new story. It sounds like you want it to be, separate, but plunder is like really negative, isn't it?
It is. And so like to me, yeah. And I wouldn't die on this hill like that what I'm doing is plundering my grandfather's story. I don't think that's true. There's a little bit like the last chapter, or as it was originally written, was actually much, much, much longer and much more, I would say, introspective. And so, yeah, this is okay. I'll dig myself the hole I always do. And so let me just say, and so basically like what I found myself in a really challenging position. And because when I got to the end of the book and I didn't have this building, and then so I'm forced into the state of like, okay, now I have to interrogate, if it's not about the building, then what am I actually doing here? And so like I went through the arguments that are in the chapter, and then the part that really got mostly deleted is that I turned it on myself. I was like, okay, then what are my own motivations? Like, what am I doing? Like, why did I do this? Like in a really honest way. And it's a very uncomfortable truth is that part of it, a small part, not the major part, but a small part of it was that I was able to get a book out of it. And like, that is a really complicated when like you sort of be really honest about my own motivations and like certain career opportunities. And like, this is what I really wanted. I really wanted a book deal. And I was able to find that space. That doesn't take away from like the mission. It doesn't make it less honest, but like I was sort of training like these guns on myself. And so I think part of the language is like leftover from that sort of like really harsh introspection. It got really meta, which is why it was cut. No one liked it except writers. Everyone else thought it was like way too heady. But yeah, I found that was like, it was a very unsettling question for me. Like when I really took stock and say, wow, I'm literally profiting. Like I'm getting paid for this. And you're just like, that was something that I sort of had to grapple with. And so I think some of that language is like vestigial from that draft.
Does that work, Jennifer? Does it help?
Yeah. So, but like now, I don't know how many years ago you wrote this. Like, I didn't mean, do you feel at peace with your family, but like, do you feel at peace with yourself? Like, have you come, full circle, or have you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me ask you or anyone else, like, did you find when you read that last chapter, did you find that word jarring? That's interesting. Like people have not told me that, but like it makes a lot of sense. Like like that is really interesting feedback. And so I don't feel unsettled anymore about it. If it did feel like a sense of catharsis in finishing the book and publishing the book, but I totally understand that reaction.
Can I just say something? It felt to me like there was a connection, almost like you were doing something sort of like the treasure hunters were doing, where they were also benefiting in a sense from somebody else's situation. And I thought maybe you were analogizing them in some way.
Yeah, I wasn't blind to some of those parallels. I think, I think the comparison is somewhat limited, but yeah, for sure. Like after writing, after coming to the end of the book in which I talk about these treasure hunters and sort of explain like the circumstances and their missions and their obsessions, and then I think some of that will touch upon me for sure.
Change of, go ahead, Carol, yeah.
No, I already said my piece, but I do want to add that all that stuff about the treasure hunters, admittedly, I was confused by the whole thing.
Fair enough.
It was so much to sift through. I was like, what? What's going on, huh? I couldn't get the name straight. I couldn't get the town straight. I was like, okay, I'll have to go with the basic. They're benefiting from somebody else's pain.
Yeah, I that's an honest read.
I'd like to ask a question. Actually, it's not for you, Menachem. It's actually for Riva and your parents. I'm very curious.
I don't know if they signed up for that.
Well, I'm curious to know, how did it feel to read Riva first? How did it feel to read your childhood in a book published? And to your parents, especially your father, how did it feel to be described on paper? Just, from your son's point of view about you. Just curious about that, since we have family here.
I love this question.
Dad, do you want to go first? Just,
No, you can go first.
keep it of an aim.
You're the moderator.
Okay. So thank you, Margot. I just want to say that, like, there's certainly only a window. Like, thankfully, Menachem did not describe my entire childhood. But really, for the most part, whatever he wrote was so pleasurable reading, because it brought back such accurate memories. Like, so much of what he wrote and the way he wrote it was like, oh my God, yes, right? Like, that's exactly what it was like. Let's say the way my uncle used to tickle us, right? And that's exactly what it was. He would pick us up, he'd put us on the banister, and he had his tickle fingers. and that was really a significant part of our relationship with him. But really, it was a very favorable experience, because it brought back many positive memories from so long ago. And Menachem is so talented that he describes it so spot on and so well and succinctly. So that was my experience. And then there were elements that were there. The first part was like, when I first started reading it, and as soon as I got it, and I got it on Amazon like everyone else, was, this is so weird to be reading about my family. There was certainly that surrealism and just like, this is just so strange. I am reading about my family, my parents, my grandparents, myself, we're all here. And it was very odd. So there was that element, was definitely part of it. So I hope that answered, or, it's elucidated it a little bit. And Dad, I turn over the mic to you.
Okay, it's a good question. It borders really on, when Menachem first approached us and said he was going to do the book. So, when approaching it from family history, your first response is, oh my God, what is he going to write? And so there's a tremendous sense of trepidation, and you tend to really focus on that part.
We're losing you.
So
Wait,
I say very open.
The connection's not great with you.
That is true. We don't have internet.
Yeah, we came back. Is it better? Okay, I think it should stabilize. Okay. Excuse me. So to Menachem's credit, he was very forthcoming. Like, he put everything on the table. And he kept us fairly apprised. I read the chapter that he submitted as a submission. And the truth was, as soon as I read the first few pages and where he describes me as tall and good looking and thin, everything was okay. So, he could do no wrong after that point. Okay. But really, I was very, very overwhelmed with the book. Like, I actually read it twice. The first one was kind of, as I go back into really saying, okay, oh my God, what did he put in? Okay, and you're just trying to focus. No, he didn't put that in. Okay, but I was so taken aback by just the beauty of the book, of the writing, the richness, the opportunity to really to get into his head, really. And as soon as I read the book, I said, it's a winner. I knew that. And so nothing that happened, and in all honesty, came as a surprise to me. And I felt that and I think, if Menachem, remember, I wrote you a note after the book, that, and I think that, I think that people like approached us and Menachem and said, oh, what do you have to do to get on the New York Times bestseller list? Like, they think of it, oh, it's some kind of protexia. If your second cousin works at New York Times, then you can get on the bestseller list. And what I did see, and I think it should be commented on, is the absolutely incredible amount of work that Menachem invested in this project. It is mind-boggling, and we are a family that really, I think, pays incredible tribute to the literary word, and we everyone in the family does do a fair bit of writing, and like really to see what what you have to go through to produce something is really astounding. The rewrites and the criticisms and everything like that. And so I really have to, I can only say that just incredibly proud of that accomplishment, and all the accolades that he's received, he certainly deserves. So, I guess in the end, I think that it was a real, it drew us closer, I think, in terms of just bringing out many things and having a very open discussion. And I really just very enjoyed being part of the entire process, And as a matter of fact, I will now make a little plug that it was very interesting. Coincidentally, I also I came out with a book, my own book, a safer. It was this was published by the OU Press, and I was almost identical. Even our jacket covers are similar. Everything.
They're both orange.
Right, but as I say, the only difference between my book and Menachem's book is if you pick up Menachem's book, you can't put it down. Mine puts you to sleep. Okay, so we all came. So it was just a wonderful experience.
I will add one thing, that to be honest, it wasn't very comfortable to see things about our family aired in public, even if for the most part it was done in a very flattering way towards our immediate family. Menachem had the courtesy and the respect to show us the final draft, before it was submitted to the publisher. And, there were some things we were not very happy about. And he let us say, okay, make notes, and which we did, many. And he was extremely accommodating. Now, we understood why this part of the story was relevant, and we wouldn't have wanted, we wouldn't have wanted to diminish the book by taking it out completely. But overall, the way it came out, I think it was not a necessary sacrifice, but a worthwhile sacrifice. And the pride and the nachas that we feel, at his achievements certainly overpowers the discomfort. I mean, it may be the discomfort just from, we're pretty private people, and it's jarring, as Reva said, to see. Thankfully, there was nothing about me except that I was, what was it? Gorgeous and shy. So that's fine. I'm cool with that.
When you were 19.
I was 19, I know.
You're still gorgeous, but you're not so shy.
But basically, we, at this point, we're just very excited about it and very happy to be a part of it. And, when people ask, are you related to Menachem Kaiser? We're very proud to say, yes, he's our son.
Yeah, that was a fun process, getting your notes.
Getting those notes.
I'll tell you, my father and my mother had very different notes.
Did you know you were going to have a second set of editors on the book?
I gave them certain sections that one chapter in particular, we actually went multiple rounds. And I worked, we had several meetings about that. And then the book as a whole, there's something called galleys, and galleys are like, they make the book, but it's not the one for sale. It's like for book reviews and media stuff, but you could still make changes. So that, and then I gave that to my parents for the whole book. And then there's certain words that my mother preferred I didn't use. I agreed with almost all of them.
Didn't change all of them.
Almost all of them. Almost all. There were certain things in there, like certain incidental details that people felt very strongly I should remove, which I removed. There were certain furniture descriptions that some people felt I should remove, and I removed.
We had a debate about furniture.
A great debate. Whether or not my grandmother covered her sofa. Turns out
Plastic.
Myths there. Whether Bubby covered her sofa in plastic. It was like it was a process I was dreading. I was like really nervous about it. But I will say, to my parents' endless credit, like they approached it in a way that I felt like understood the project as a whole, understood like how it functions, like that the story had to be told, sort of swallowed some of their discomfort for my sake, which I'm very grateful for. I'm really trying to get it into the Myra Vorhead Library, which
I think you have to explain that, Menachem.
My mother runs is a librarian, has run a library in my shul in Toronto, the Aguda, and it's an English library. And so I feel like I'm on the cusp of getting my book in there. Mom, am I close?
Yeah, as soon as you get the book published by Feldheim, it will be allowed in the library.
So maybe I'm not so close, but one day I'll have a book in that library.
We are getting late, and this has been wonderful. Menachem, there was one more question addressed that was written. I don't know how much you want to address of it. I'll just read it off. Can we assume that, oh my God, means the golden eggs were there? We can't have a book talk without getting to that most important question.
Let me ask how many people think.
Look at this.
Let me take a quick vote. If people think the golden eggs were there. I see one raised hand. No one else. Oh, Rebecca believes that. And how many people think they weren't there? All right, everyone else abstains. Well, you don't get to know. I'm waiting for permission from Steve. He's supposed to give me the go ahead, because people are curious in ways that I am weirdly surprised by, but it makes sense. It's interesting information that I am withholding.
Rightfully curious, but in the end, it's just still such a strong ending. So it's, whether or not they were there, it was just such a perfect way to end the book. So I want to
You have to
thank
have
everyone for
permission
coming.
For sure they were there. Can I just say one thing? When I read it twice also like your father. I think when you read a book, a narrative like yours, you read it from I read it from your perspective. And then when you spoke about your father being born in 1952, I said, oh my God, that's my generation. I was born in 1952 and you were born in the year of my daughter. So I had to keep reminding myself that I was off a generation in the whole story and in perspective. So and I thought that was very interesting.
Thank you.
Sure, for sure. I mean, just one last note. When I read it, I certainly felt that I was reading a perspective of the Holocaust from a third generation. And it was very different in that sense from any other Holocaust genre book that I read, because those were either written by survivors or by children of survivors or from the survivor's perspective. So this was, wait a second, this is a book for our generation on so many different ways to think about and talk about and approach the Holocaust in really a new way for who we are and what our relationship is. So that really kind of ties into what you said, Rebecca. Thank you. Anything else before I let everyone go, because we are getting late.
I put an email address in the chat if people want to be in touch, or I mean, or just ask Riva for my contact info if people want to be in touch with their stories. Or I would love to hear people write me the reclamation stories all the time. I'm always really interested in hearing, or if sometimes people want advice. I mean, I have not been successful, as you know, but I can definitely give you information for people who know more than I do about, you know, reclamation or restitution or traveling to that part of the world. I'd be really happy to help.
Great. Thank you, Menachem. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I hope we'll see all of you at our next book club.
I want to thank Riva for doing an incredible job this evening.
Yes. Thank you so much, Riva.
Thank you, Menachem. Thank you, parents. Thank you, everyone.
For allowing this program to proceed. I think everyone benefited from it.
Thank you all. Have a great
Good night.
day.
Thanks,
night.
everyone.
Hey.
Good night. Thank you.